Welcome back. I am looking at the State of CSS survey 2021, which time this goes out might have already closed for entries. There's some really interesting way they've phrased certain questions. Some are just asking how familiar you are with certain CSS frameworks or features and things like that, but they've come down to opinions. There is this question about CSS pain points. For each one, pick the aspect of CSS you struggle with the most. And it's kind of structured like a little tournament. I thought it'd be quite fun to just run through what conclusions I came to and some of my thinking, because it'd be a good thing to get any discussion points about. So generally you just kind of rank them when they're up against each other to find what is basically the main CSS pain point for you. I'll have a look at this one first. It's so form element styling versus browser compatibility. I feel like browser compatibility is becoming less and less of an issue these days, in that the features generally are widely adopted, or your confidence in taking something on board to use is dependent on whether it is widely adopted. It's very rare now you take something on and think, but it doesn't work here, so I'll create a fallback and I'll create a browser hack and I'll work around it. Generally, for comfort, you kind of think, well, I'll only take it once it's ready for all the browsers I want to use. So I'm not running into browser compatibility. Form element styling is still one of the big hitters, I think, in that it's still very hard to get access to those inner elements. The HTML isn't exposing things like drop downs, things like radio buttons. They're still hard to get to things, and you usually have to sort of work around them. It's improving, but it's still quite a pain. Responsive design, similarly, I think most of the time you've got a mindset, you're either using some framework or some structure that you've got some mobile upscale, you've got a grid that will adapt at certain breakpoints. Again, we try not to overthink it too much. The responsive stuff is hopefully usually a few quirks and few settings. It's not as much of a stress. But in scoping and specificity, it's also not a big killer. I think responsive design would probably win out here, but scoping is kind of not often a bug I'm running into, and usually just, again, it's about how you're structuring your CSS. Usually these days with some CSS in JS tool that's kind of handled for you as well. Layout and positioning, not a common problem, I think. Again, we have the grid flexbox stuff that makes it quite easy to maneuver things around the pages. Don't think I've often run into big problems about trying to get things into the right position. Architecture and maintenance is, I suppose, a big one. That's very much about where you try and run into your problems much further down the road when you kind of picked about how you want to lay out and structure things. That's always hard to get right and something you're going to keep running into. Performance issues on the CSS side are not so heavy. Just recently completed those videos about CSS performance. I don't think it's I think as long as you've got a good strategy and you're able to again scope and control things, I don't think it's a common thing you run into is trying to improve your performance of your CSS. Interactions, yeah, I think certainly getting certain events and things, but it's not a big problem. I suppose I'd pick that of the two, but architecture would win out when against interactions. Form elements would beat out on responsive design. So really it's just what's the pain of how form elements work is certainly a big one for me, but I think always architecture and maintenance is going to be your overall winner, just because of that's the big problem, is about how you think things through and how adaptable you can make your system, that's going to be easy to work with changes and work with big teams and be able to be adopted and not run into all kinds of problems. So that's the way I've landed on this layout. The second one they did is, what do you feel is currently missing from CSS? And it's in the same structure. So really about just feature lists you wish you had, what would be quite helpful. Parent selector, yes, I think it's quite often you want to do that. Something like a little ampersand to just also style your parent when a certain, that would be quite lovely. Mixin's good, very useful, but I think you're either using a CSS in JS to let you get some of that functionality, or you can sort of on a low level find ways around it, which I'll cover in another video. I'm going to go for parent selector there. Color functions, more details, functions for manipulating color values. We're missing a little bit. What I'd like is the ability to use hex codes in RGBA to just be able to just supply like, or not just CSS like color names, to be able to just have like red and then an alpha on it and avoid things. So there's some things would be good to have. Browser support. Again, I don't think it's so much of an issue these days. I'm going to pick the color functions. Nesting, I believe is on the plan. It's coming soonish. It's not in any browsers yet, but there is a kind of spec for nesting, native nesting in CSS, which will be a big deal. As with subgrid, I think that's actually adopted quite commonly. So not yet run into an issue where subgrid has been needed. I would pick nesting because I think that's becoming so intuitive now, certainly with any CSS and JS. Obviously with Sass, you're just constantly working in that nested way that it's actually quite hard to unthink that and work in a regular CSS way sometimes. Scoping. So there's stuff about extra scoping layers coming to CSS, which enable you to kind of control scoping. But I don't think it's as much of a problem, again, just based on your architecture and how you've decided to write your classes. Container queries, of course, is the big one. Again, on the plan, I believe it's probably in the next year or so it'll be here. So container queries has been long asked for. It's probably been the most demanded thing. Parent selector versus color functions. I would still go with the parent selector narrowly. I think that would just be solving more problems than the color functions. The color functions, you can pretty much do everything, I think. It's just the format's not ideal and you're having to convert them and things. Nesting and container queries. This is the biggest battle of them all, because both these would be excellent things that really help. I think container queries, just because of nowadays people think in components so much, you really want to just control all your component logic and styles in one place rather than just wait on some browser width settings. It'd be nicer to have real scoped container queries. So I'm going to just pick those narrowly, and they're going to win out overall, I think, as over parent selector. But those three, I think parent selector, container queries, and nesting, that's a close heat, because of those three together would just give you so much power and leverage to be able to control component level CSS and write things in really succinct and clever ways. So that's where I landed on that. If the survey's still open, I would recommend signing up to it, or at least signing up so you get notified for the following year and for the results of this one when they come out. It's always good, even if you don't feel you know lots of CSS stuff, that's at least useful feedback to show what things you are aware of, and it helps give an idea of, as an industry, what things are emerging and what things are being adopted in the industry. So one to pay attention to. Otherwise, your opinions of what won out for you on those questions. What are the things that trouble you most in CSS, and what are the features you'd most like to see? That's always really useful feedback. That's all. Go have a nice day.